his death, it may be released.
And now that John Rollo has died, we can release that story. An unusual request, that.
And by an unusual man of great integrity, I always felt, as well as a most ingenious, most resourceful and inventive man. Great patriot. And he had a string of satellite factories throughout Scotland.
And he actually flew his own plane to get to his factories, didn't he?
Yes. He had been a pilot in the First War, and his name will always be associated with the Highland Fund that he has established to help enterprises in the Highlands. And then he was the deputy chairman when the Highlands and Islands Development Board was founded.
And yet he was essentially a modest man.
Oh, a modest man and a likable man, a forthright man. This integrity of his showed in his dealings with the Stone of Destiny when, to his surprise, he was saddled with looking after an object that had always meant a great deal to him.
Well, the Stone of Destiny was the stone in which the Scottish kings were crowned. It was reputed to have been the pillow of Jacob and was brought to Ireland sometime during the first 700 or 800 years of this period, then was brought to Donad in Argyllshire near Lochgilphead, which was the headquarters of the kings of Dalriada. From there it was taken to Scone, where it was used as the crowning stone for the kings of Scotland. It was stolen from Scone by Edward I and taken to Westminster. And although his heirs entered into a treaty with the Scots to return it, this was never honoured.
Yes, it was later built into the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, and that was where I first saw it. The important thing is the legend that surrounds it. In 1950, a group of nationalist students at Glasgow decided that they were going to retrieve the stone, and they did succeed in removing it. The nationalist movement in Scotland at this time was really looking to the leadership of John McCormick and his Scottish Convention. Were you involved in that at all?
Yes, I was a member of the Covenant Committee. It had many prominent people on it, such as John Cameron QC, today Lord Cameron, the Chorus Session, and many other prominent people who all subscribed non-politically to their belief that the future of Scotland lay in getting some form of self-government to further our own country.
In this movement, did you know in advance anything at all about the taking of the stone from Westminster?
Oh, nothing whatever. The first I heard of it was sitting at lunch in the Works Canteen on Christmas Day, and I heard in the 1 o'clock news an announcement that the Stone of Destiny had been stolen from Westminster. I was vastly amused at this, and I waited to hear what further developments would come from it.
Now, let me take you back to Christmas 1950. There were 4 Glasgow students, all motivated by the desire for home rule for Scotland, all involved in the actual taking of the Stone of Scone from the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, where it had been for some 600 years. The leader was Ian Hamilton. Later, he qualified as an advocate in QC, even sitting on the bench as a sheriff. With him, inside the Abbey, were Alan Stewart and Gavin Vernon. Sitting in the lane outside the door near Poets' Corner was the driver of the getaway car, a girl from the West Highlands, Kay Matheson. The first idea had been for Ian Hamilton to attend evensong and then to hide in a dark corner so that later on he could open the door for the other 2. But he was spotted, taken for a down-and-out trying to get free lodging for the night, and thrown out. Late that Christmas Eve, the 3 came back to the door at Poets' Corner, armed with a jemmy, and burst it open. Ian Hamilton.
There was a light glowing, but just shone sufficiently for us to see the way round through the metal grille, up the narrow wooden stair, and right into the confessor's chapel, where the stone lay under the coronation chair.
We got the stone out of the chair, placed it on the floor, and then Ian took his coat off so that we could all drag it on that. Alan and I taking an arm of the coat each, and Ian taking one of the chains of the stone. And as soon as he pulled, the stone gave way.
What we didn't know then, but we know now, was that it was damaged about 40 years ago when the suffragettes put a bomb here. But what was quite amazing then has surprised me a bit, that the way all of us, and Kay also later, was able to pick up that small piece of stone weighing about 90 pounds and run with it as though it was a football and we were on the soccer field or the rugby field.
Yes, Ian, and when you come back, you just grabbed your corner of the coat when we heard the car start forward. You dashed out to see what was happening, and that was the last we saw of you.
And of course what was happening was that Kay had moved the car forward, not as I thought because she was getting impatient, but because she had seen a policeman coming, and it chose that way to warn us. And I jumped in beside Kay. I remember sitting making love, at the same time pulling an old coat that we had in the back of the car over the broken piece.
Yes, and do you remember how he took his helmet off and lit a cigarette?
Yes, and of course we told them that, well, it was Christmas Eve and we'd nowhere to go and we were young and we wanted to make love, and I think he rather understood.
While all that was happening, the other two, that's Gavin Vernon and Alan Stewart, were struggling to manhandle the main part of the stone along to the door. And they felt more than just a bit cross when they heard Ian and Kay outside talking in such loud voices. Of course, with the policeman there, they were trying to give a warning. Then they heard the car start up, under the copper's instructions, and drive off down the lane. Gavin and Alan felt all the adrenaline just draining out of them. All they could do, they thought, was to abandon the stone and make themselves scarce, which they did. When Ian and Kay reached the car park to pick up the hired vehicle, another drama, no keys. Ian had left them in the pocket of the coat they'd used to drag the stone. Kay Matheson, still with the smaller chunk of the stone in the boot, drove off westwards, anywhere, to get out of the danger area.
He was going along Knightsbridge Street at the lights suddenly turned red, and I thought, I mustn't break the law by charging the lights. So I stopped dead, and the stone banged against the back of the car, hit the boot, and fell out into Knightsbridge Street. But luckily it was all wrapped up, as you know, in the rug, so it wasn't damaged.
Dear, dear. And how you picked up that stone weighing 90 pounds and put it into the boot of the car, I don't know.
I can't even remember the weight of it now.
From the car park, Ian Hamilton footed it back to the Abbey, hoping to rescue the car keys, then fetch the car round and, with the help of the others, take away the stone. More dramas. The stone was there, but his chums weren't. And the keys were not in the pocket of his coat. Fallen out, maybe. So, on hands and knees, he crawled right to the high altar, hands cautiously sweeping the paving, sometimes striking a match, but no joy. All the way back to the stone, baffled. And then all the way back to the stone, baffled. And then he stood on something. The keys.
And I think that was almost a miracle. And I went back and I got the car out, and I just drove up the lane to where you had left the stone, outside the door of the Abbey. And, well, it weighs about 300 wits. And I don't know what weight I am, but it's nothing like that. But again, miraculously, and I really think that this was a miracle, I managed to manhandle it into the car. And you remember the final miracle, when I was driving along and I was looking for a place to hide the stone, and you remember how I got lost, and I was driving down somewhere off the old Kent Road, and I saw you two plodding away.
We hadn't a clue where we were, and it was a terrific surprise to us when you pulled up at the side of the road.
And then Ian and Alan headed off towards the Kent countryside, not far from Rochester.
We finally found a place in open country, you remember, not a very good place, just over a hedge in a field down a lane about 20 yards from the road. and we hid the stone there. We'd meant really to leave the stone there for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks until the hue and cry had died down. But we set away yourself, Alan, myself, a man whose name mustn't be mentioned, but whom we shall call Neil Rock, and another university graduate, John Jocelyn. And we drove right down to Rochester. And remember with what horror we found when we got outside Rochester that there was a camp of gypsies right on the top of the stone. Neil and I went out of the car and we went up to the gypsies' campfire and we sat down and asked if we could have the hospitality of their fire. And Neil talked to them and he sat there in front of the fire, and it was at night, and the sweat was out in his face as he talked. And he talked about freedom and about how the gypsies were harried from one place to another and about how we too were working the cause of freedom. And then he said, there's something in the wood there that we want. It's illegal, but it's not wrong. Will you help us to get it out? And the gypsies helped us to carry it to the car.
And the fact that the coronation stone was missing wasn't discovered, in fact, until the morning of Christmas Day, and at once it was reported to the Dean of Westminster.
Now, the Dean, the very Reverend Dr. A.C. Donn, was a Scotsman, and apparently at first he didn't take too serious a view of this, but he thought he'd better report to the palace. And doing this, he suddenly found that he was speaking to King George VI. Suddenly there was an explosion, and His Majesty tore strips off him and said that everything must be done to get this back immediately. And I was told later by the duty officer who was on Broadcasting House that morning that he got a visit from the Dean, who was trembling, pale, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead, begging for permission to get on the radio to make an appeal for the return of the stone, which was done.
The stone of Scone has been stolen. This senseless crime had clearly been carefully planned and was carried out with great cunning. It had been in the Abbey for over 600 years, and not till this week has anyone dared to lay sacrilegious hands upon it. His Majesty, as I have reason to know, is greatly distressed. What I want to do is to appeal to all of you who are listening to me to make it a matter of personal concern that the stone of Scone should be recovered. And if you have any idea where it may be, let the police know, or else let me know, and I will go to the ends of the earth to fetch it back.
But he didn't have to. But more than 100 days and nights were to pass before he saw it again. And this is the point where John Rollo was brought into the story, and this is the part that until now has never been made public, just as John Rollo told it to Archie Lee and myself those many years ago.
Beyond what appeared in the press, I heard nothing. But on Hogmanay, 1950, about 6:30, this was the end of our financial year, and I was clearing up items of stock taking, particularly work in progress, before the end of the year, and the phone rang. And a voice said, this is John Stone. And then I recognized the voice as being that of Robert Gray. And he said, I have 2 people here who would like to see you. How long will you be at the works? And I said, well, I'll wait till you come. When will you be there? And he said, about 7:30. Bertie Gray was a prominent member of the National Party, the Covenant, and was John McCormick's right-hand man. In fact, he is a monumental sculptor in Glasgow and actually had made 1 or more accurate reproductions of the Stone of Destiny in his monumental yard. At 7:30, a car drew up outside the works, and Bertie came in and brought with him 2 people who he introduced to me as Ian Hamilton and Alan Stewart. And he said, you probably wonder why we've come to see you. I said, yes. Well, he said, you're a good Scot. I've got the Stone of Destiny here. Will you look after it?
What did you feel when he said that?
Slightly amused. But it didn't take any thought to make the decision. I said, yes, I'll take it. After all, here was something that I had venerated as a boy, and it was being brought to me. We went out to the car in Armstrong Sidley, and there, where the front seat should have been, was the Stone of Destiny covered with a rug. So I told them to back the car into the big door of the works, which they did, and they then lifted the stone out. And to my horror, I saw that roughly a fifth of it was missing at one corner, broken off. The boys told me that they'd driven across the border with it and never been questioned, with Alan Stewart sitting on it, but they hadn't had a meal for, I think, 8 or 9 hours. And I told Bertie Gray, I'll take this on one condition. No one but myself will ever know where it is. Because a secret is a secret when it's with one person only. He agreed to that, and they went off and left me with the stone, and I went home.
Now, I think we should also say that he wasn't just a businessman and a politician with nationalist leanings. He was a councillor and a magistrate in the city of Glasgow.
That's right. The next day, I was worried about the age of the stone. I was worried in case atmospheric conditions, winter, cold or humidity might affect it. So the next morning, the Sunday, I went up to the works early, I drew it out on its trolley, and I built a very strong packing case for the exact size of the stone and lined it. I lifted the stone with overhead gear, remembering again was about 400 pounds here, lowered it into the case, closed the case. I then looked for a hiding place and decided the best place was a space beneath the foreman's office, in front of which stood a lathe which was in daily use. And I had to remove all the planking from the front of this office and eventually slide the stone and its case into this aperture. I then replaced the boards in front. I had to use new nails for this, and I was worried about the bright heads of the nails. So I got the Leclanche batteries, which in those days were used for the telephone bell extension, and brushed all the heads of the nails with sal ammoniac from these batteries, which made them rust immediately. So it was obviously old rusty nails, if anyone looked. While I was putting the stone into its case, there was a loud knock came apparently at the door, a loud rat-tat-tat. And this shook me stiff, because I couldn't answer the door with the stone lying open, half into a case. I ignored it, and it was quite a bit. And then perhaps 10 minutes later came this loud rat-tat-tat, getting more imperative than ever. So I went to the door. There was no one there. I came back, and again, it was becoming by this time somewhat eerie, alone in the place with the Stone of Destiny, half-packed, and the rat-tat-tat came louder than ever. So I went outside to look what it was and found there was a big black crow up on the asbestos ridging of the roof of the fitting shop, was pecking its beak, cleaning it on the ridge.
And this was what had given you the fright.
So I got the stone safely into its place and went off home.
Now, what had happened to this smaller portion of the stone with a ring in it?
This was taken by K. Matheson separately.
That was the bit taken north by K. Matheson.
Yes, and there were two more coincidences here. First of all, she stopped to spend the night with friends in Birmingham, discovered that she was invited to a Christmas dinner at which her main guest was the Chief Constable of the Midlands. There he was, in the room next door, was part of the Stone of Destiny that every bobby in the country was looking for. And she managed to carry it off and got home to Inverasdale. Now, at Inverasdale, John had one of his small subsidiary factories, and any time he went to visit it, he stayed in the house next door, which was run by a widow lady, Mrs. Matheson, mother of Kay.
So John actually knew Kay, and indeed had known her for some time.
Oh yes, knew her well, but The funny thing was, he didn't know that she had been involved in taking the stone, nor did she know that he now had the stone.
Within 2 or 3 days, I started getting phone messages. Somebody had been mentioning my name, and newspaper reporters and others were phoning up. We believe you know something about the Stone of Destiny. And I said, look, I haven't got the Stone of Destiny, it's not here, which was perfectly true because I was speaking from home. About the 12th of January, I got a phone message from David Forrester, who was the secretary of the Covenant Committee, very late at night, after midnight. Could I come to his house? He had something very urgent for me. There had been a very heavy snowfall. There was something like 8 inches of snow lying. And I got into my car and drove into Bishopbriggs to his house. And because Davy Goodfellow's factory was at Cambus Kenneth, on the Stirling side of the footbridge over to Cambus Kenneth Abbey, alongside the Forth, and at a stone's throw from the Abbey of Cambus Kenneth. It was absolutely correct. It was astoundingly correct.
And when you heard this declaration by the clairvoyant, what did you feel?
Well,
did you think the bubbles would be on you?
I was too astounded, but perhaps I can go back to the taking of the stone to Cambus Kenneth.
Mm-hmm.
It was increasingly obvious from phone contacts and one thing and another that inquiries were narrowing down towards me, and I decided I must move the stone. And I arranged with Tommy Smith that I would send over some of the cases, this was on a Friday, on the Monday.
Suddenly something has come into my mind. Is there a tiny item here missing? Were you not visited by a sergeant of police after you put the stone, the smaller portion, in its HP sauce carton into your knee-hole desk? Were you not visited by a sergeant of police who sat and chatted to you, resting his feet actually on this carton?
Well, remember that the main portion of the stone was sealed in its case, and it was it I was going to take to Stirling. But I was still left with the HP sauce carton. And I thought, well, I'll take one person into my confidence about the small piece. And this was my co-director, the late James Scott. And I said, look, Jim, I've got the small portion of the Stone and Destiny in an HP sauce carton here. Would you stick it in the corner of your garage at home? And without any hesitation, he took it and did so. I told him nothing about the rest, nor did I discuss that I had the main portion. I was still concerned with getting it to Stirling for storage. And on the Friday, from other police movements that were being made elsewhere, it was obvious that inquiries were coming rapidly towards me. And I decided on Monday I would put it in a Bedford van, which we have, and drive it to Stirling myself, and send the other 6 cases over on our lorry, which was away at one of our branch factories at the time. On Monday morning, to my horror, the driver of the van came out of the works gate and hit a lorry, and the van was completely written off. So I was left without transport, unless I had transport to go to Stirling. But I had a small trailer which I used to tow stuff to Easdale factory in, but unfortunately the car that towed this was a Jowett Javelin, and I had sold it the week before the new year. So I had a bit of a problem, and I got onto the man that I had sold it to and said, look, could I borrow the drawbar hitch from the back of your car? He said, as a matter of fact, he said, it's away, it won't be available tomorrow, but I'll give you the car if you want a loan of it. So I said, right, I'll get the car tomorrow. Meantime, I had to get this thing out of the place. And the only car I could get that I could hitch this onto was a small Renault. And we quickly made a drawbar for the back. And I decided I was only going to risk to take it so far. So I took it to Hawk's garage at Denny, who did all of our repair work. And I said, would you mind if I stored this trailer overnight? It was covered with a hap. And I'll pick it up tomorrow with the Jowett. And it lay in Hawk's garage that night. The next day was John McCormick's rectorial inauguration. And I had promised old Willie Power that I would take him in to the inauguration. And I had got hold of the Jowett Javelin that morning. I picked him up at Stirling, took him to the inauguration in Glasgow. On the road back to Stirling, called in at Hawk's garage and picked up the trailer. And a very clear recollection of passing Bannockburn House, and Willie turned to me and he said, "John, I wonder if the stone really is in Scotland." And Willie never knew until he died that the stone was within 2 yards of him, behind him in a trailer, and I couldn't tell him.
He was a great journalist and a great patriot too.
Well, I delivered Willie to his house, and the stone in its box was put into the mill at Cambus Kenneth. And the next day, the 6 other cases were sent over for storage. Everything appeared now to be safe. There were comings and goings. I would periodically get phone messages from John McCormick to meet him and Bertie Gray in a pub in Blythewood Street, where they would tell me what was happening. They also made many endeavours, as did other people, to find out where the stone was. But I professed ignorance. I said I hadn't it. It wasn't in my possession, which was perfectly true because it had passed out of my possession. But about this period, I decided I would get in conversation with one of the legal luminaries in Scotland of the time. Get into a discussion when I got a suitable opportunity. And I got on to the discussion of the Stone of Destiny. And I said, look, suppose someone received the Stone of Destiny and looked after it, knowing nothing about its taking, and was given it in Scotland and simply acted as a caretaker. If he was found in possession of it, what would the charge be? He said, that's an interesting argument, because he said, if he knew nothing of it, he was no party to the English charge of sacrilege. If it could be proved it was stolen property, and it was given to him in Scotland, then he was a resetter in Scots law. He would be guilty of reset. But before a charge of reset could be raised, ownership of the alleged stolen articles would have to be proved. And he said this would be the crux of the whole thing.
What right had the Crown in England to possession?
Who was the owner? Matters dragged on. No further indications came that anyone was interested in me. The reason of this turned out subsequently to be that Gavin Vernon, who was one of the boys engaged in the taking, and who actually carried the front seat of that Armstrong Sidley through York to the train on his head, lived in lodgings with a boy called David Rollo, who was no relation of mine whatever. And of course, amongst students, the word had gone round that Rollo knew where the stone was. And apparently this reached the police. And the inquiries centred on this Rollo, who shared the lodgings, and the police officially, I believe, came to the conclusion that this Rollo in Bonnybridge was a respectable, innocent man, and his name has been brought into this quite fortuitously and by accident. Towards the end of March, the to's and froings that had been going between John McCormick, the authorities, John Gordon, and one thing and another.
Yes, that John Gordon, you see, of the Sunday Express, he was at that time its editor.
Oh, that's right.
He was brought into it through the agency of Hector McNeill.
I see.
Because Hector had been, like me, for a time. In fact, I got him work with the Express, where I was working at the time. And when he went to London as a Member of Parliament, he used to write leading articles for Lord Beaverbrook, got to know John Gordon, and it later struck him that this could be a means of retrieving the stone. It would never do for the government to pay for the return, but if he could persuade the newspaper to pay, no questions asked, then it would achieve the result of retrieving it and putting at rest the mind of the dying king.
Towards the end of March, John McCormick and Bertie Gray approached me and said negotiations were proceeding for the return of the stone, arrangements being made through John Gordon with some form of joint ownership. He would spend part of the year in the Abbey of Holyrood and the other part in the Abbey at Westminster, and it might be handed back. Would I hand it over? I said, yes, I'll hand it over when I'm quite sure what's going to happen to it. So they said, could I get a hand barrow made, a mason's hand barrow of high quality, on which it would be carried? I said, well, I'll see what I can do. It's going to be a funny looking thing to ask for. However, I went to a friend of mine who had a coach building establishment in Perth, Stuart Henderson, and I told Stuart I wanted him to construct a very nice mason's hand barrow for carrying articles for exhibition on. And I sketched what I wanted, and it was made in polished teak. And he made a most beautiful hand barrow, which was delivered to me the following week. I took it home that night, carried it into the house late, and stuck it beneath my bed. It was seen by my daughters and said, what's that for? I said, it's for carrying the stone of destiny. And they laughed loud and long, ha, 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 ha. Great joke. The next day I took it in my car to Glasgow and gave it to Bertie Gray at his monumental yard, because it was the sort of thing that might be used in the monumental yard, except that it was much better finished. However, he took it into his office there. Then I got a phone message from John McCormick, could I meet him, and Bertie again in Glasgow. I met him and he told me, we've decided that we're going to repair the stone. And we're going to do it in my house. And I said, look, John, you're daft. Your house will be watched day and night. No, he said, I'm quite satisfied. If you will arrange to bring the stone in, I will have a body of students who will carry it up. About 4 floors this was up where he lived. And Bertie Gray's masons will repair the stone. So I said, well, I'll bring the small piece in first. And this was on Good Friday. So again I took James Scott into my confidence and said, Jim, we're going to deliver a small part of the stone to John McCormick's house tonight. I'm not happy. Will you put it in your car and follow me? I'll go in my car. This was at the period of acute coal shortage. And I said, I'll take a carton full of coal. When I get to John McCormick's house, you stop 50 yards down the street. I will make a dunny run into the house with a carton of coal. If I'm stopped, I'll tell them it's a carton of coal for John McCormick. He has none. If that is all right and I get through and back, we'll take your carton up there and I'll take it out. So I did this and I went up the stair, rang the bell, and Margaret McCormick answered the door. I said, is John in? She said, no, he won't be back until very late tonight. But I said, good Lord, haven't you students here? I said, I've got some of the hot goods downstairs. Well, she said, don't bring it up here. Well, I didn't know what to do with the thing. I didn't know what was happening. I came down the stair, and as I crossed into my car, James Scott gave one flash of his headlights down the street. I nipped in quickly and drove off, and he followed me. And we pulled up in West Princess Street. He said, you were no sooner up the stair with the carton than 2 policemen in uniform came out of the area, up the steps. The sunken part below the steps into the house. They looked into your car, they made a note of your number, and they went back then to watch events. So I flashed the lights to tell you something was on. I said, right, what are we going to do? To give me the bit of the stone. And I took it. I heard the way out the road. I decided then I must find some place to put it, because they had the number of my car. They knew who I was by this time, no doubt. So I phoned another friend of mine, and I said, look, Murray, I have a carton here that I want particularly put out of the way tonight, and it'll be collected tomorrow. He said, what is it? I said, never mind what it is. It's something that's wanted. I just want it lost. Well, he said, I'll phone somebody. If you'll go out to Classyth, I arrange for a farmer friend of mine to come and pick up your carton and he'll store it away up the hills. As long as you undertake it will be collected tomorrow. And this all worked. It was collected in due course, and I went on home expecting the police to arrive any time, but nothing happened.
All the time that the stone was in your possession, the newspapers were keeping the story alive. Did you feel at all alarmed in case the hunt should eventually pin you down?
No, I don't think so. I was only a caretaker. I was looking after something which I had always held in reverence, but which I was desperately shocked.
Time that the stone was in your possession, the newspapers were keeping the story alive. Did you feel at all alarmed in case the hunt should eventually pin you down?
No, I don't think so. I was only a caretaker. I was looking after something which I had always held in reverence, but which I was desperately shocked. I kept my promise. After this fiasco at John McCormick's house, I was into his house the next morning, furious. I didn't know whether I was trying to make a scapegoat off. I couldn't make up my mind on anything. John said, oh, I must have been drunk when I asked you to do that. Well, I said, what are you going to do? You've got to do something about it now. Well, he said, we're going to have the stone repaired. And he said, we've got to find a place. Could we repair it in your works? I said, no. You do your own repairing. I'm a caretaker. I regard my period of caretaking now as nearly as an end. You've got your hand barrow. You say it's going to be handed back in honourable circumstances. I can get my discharge as a caretaker. What do you want done with it? Oh, I'll need to find somebody to take it. And he phoned Bertie Gray. What would they do about it? Bertie Gray suggested it should be taken to Willie White's house in Bearsden. And it was arranged that I would take the main part of the stone in its case there. At 8 o'clock on Easter Monday, Bertie Gray would have a mason with brass dowel pins there, and they would repair the stone and arrange its handbag. Well, I collected the stone in the Bedford van, which had been rebuilt by this time, and arrived at Willie White's house in Bearsden about 8:30, found Bertie Gray, John McCormick, and a mason. And the case was opened, the stone was taken out. I saw the mason start to chip the holes for the brass dowels for repairing it. And I said, right, John, I am away. My job as caretaker is over. There is the stone. I've also got the hand barrow made for you. I'll now wait to see it honourably handed back. And I left. I knew nothing more about it until I saw the shameful way it was abandoned on my hand barrow at the Abbey of Arbroath.
And then it was removed by police car. It was once again arrested.
That's right.
Removed to London. Did you feel any relief to be quit of it?
No, I felt a feeling of shame at the way it had been dumped at Arbroath and people scalped away and left it to be collected. This was far from what I had told would take place with an honourable handover. An interesting thing was the following winter, I was a joint guest of honour at a dinner in Inverness with Hector McNeill. And Hector said to me on that occasion, you know, you should never have given it back. You had a wonderful bargaining power. But I said, Hector, I never had it. I was only a caretaker.
John Rollo, the man who hid the Stone of Destiny, died in December 1985. He spoke of his part in the exploit to Archie Peeley and Murdoch Macpherson, who made the recording in March 1973, and the tapes have been locked away until now. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 minutes past 12, it's springtime in the country. It's said that the countryside is at its best during the spring months when all new life begins. And Willie McCowan, hill walker and journalist, takes listeners en route to the bonny valley of Strathyre in Perthshire to have a look at the rural countryside's transition at this time of the year.